I'm so glad that even with lockdown and social distancing, I can join you today and bring some thoughts that I really hope will encourage you and will inspire you as you lead your people faithfully in Jesus' name. I've spent the last 20 years working with emerging generations, and it's a real passion of mine, as I know it is of yours too, to see emerging generations really capture what it means to be utterly surrendered to Jesus. There's a tantalizing question that Jesus asks in John chapter 5, where he heals the man who's been an invalid for about 39 years at the pool of Bethesda. And Jesus finds out, like, who is the person that's been here the longest. And the disciples and others point him out. And then Jesus asks him this question: do you want to be healed? Do you want to be well? I mean, Jesus is essentially saying, do you want things to change? And I guess when I look at the situation at the moment, globally with COVID-19, and God says to us, do you want things to change? And the overwhelming answer is yes, God. But particularly when we kind of narrow it down and we think about emerging generations and we think about how young people are leaving the church in droves, and we think about how it's increasingly difficult to reach young people who might be growing up in really post-Christian areas and Christian communities. When God says to us, do you want this to change? Our overwhelming answer is yes, God. Leslie Newbigin, that wonderful theologian, says that in every generation, the gospel is forwarded to a new address. I'm an activist, I'm an extrovert. I love seeking out those new addresses that the gospel is being forwarded to. So it's not the good news of Jesus that changes ever. That is unchanging. But what does change is that as leaders, we are called to really understand what's happening in this moment, to have a thick description of the emerging generation so that we can really faithfully and credibly communicate the gospel. So that's what I'd like to do. So I've divided the talk into two halves. So the first half is called Understanding This Moment, and we're looking at emerging generations, some key ideas to help us understand what's going on for them, what shapes their thinking and their worldview and their framework, which might mean that often they mishear what we're saying or they don't quite connect with what's going on in terms of church. And that's going to end with 3 discussion questions, because actually the wisdom's in the room. Like, I'm not an expert on this, I'm just an adventurer, maybe adventuring more in this particular area than maybe you've been doing, but we're just sharing the wisdom together, aren't we, and seeking enlightenment from the Spirit. And the second half of the session is called Usurp the Moment, and usurp means like work against it, like take it over, like rip it apart and change it, and in a way it's about making the most of the opportunities of reaching this exciting generation who are so different and so brilliant and so phenomenal. What can we do? So some key things that can help us in that thinking, and that's going to end with a little chance for discussion again. So part 1, understanding this moment. And I really hope my phone doesn't run out of juice, because I've got kids that have been playing on it all morning. But anyway, we will see how it goes. So part 1, understanding this moment. Well, I think it's worth thinking about the different generations, and generations are a lens through which to see wider society. It's not a label to oversimplify things, but it sometimes helps to be as simple and focused as possible in the appreciation of what on earth is going on. And the story of the shifting generations in this country and in the West, identifying the aspirations, the needs, and the different way identity is expressed, can be neatly told by looking at the way the British Army has recruited soldiers, both during the war that we were celebrating on VE Day, the end of that war, right up until this present day. So in a nutshell, this is quite neatly how we can think about the different generations in our church communities and in our wider communities. So the traditionalists, the silent generation, those born 1945 and before, the way the British Army appealed to them to get them on board was simply to say, we want you. And that was enough. We want you. You're needed. Get on board. Then we have the baby boomers, those born 1946 to 1964. And the way the British Army appealed to the psyche of that generation was to say, we want you and your devotion to duty and the common good. They could really appeal to that in them. And then rattling through Generation X, those born 1965 to 1970, 1976, the British Army appealed to, in them, they appealed to, we want you and your hunger for adventure and to make a difference. If you have that generation in your church, very much the history makers generation, like we want to change the world, we want to make a difference. Real innovators, actually, that generation. And then number 4, millennials or Gen Y, those born 1977 up until the end of the 1990s. This is how the British Army appeals to them. We want you and your self-belief, that sense that you can do this, that you've got what it takes. And then, of course, we have the emerging generations now, Generation Z and after them, Generation Alpha. These are the 5G reality generations. And I guess in a nutshell, the appeal to the emerging generations is we want you to do you. We want you to be you. And there's lots of reasons behind that. But I guess just like flicking through very briefly that kind of very loose overview of the different generations, what is interesting to consider is that for some of you in your churches in leadership, you have all those generations in your church. Now that is culturally so unusual. 200 years ago, we weren't seeing the rapid cultural change that we are seeing now. We are living through a time of rapid and seismic generational shift. And with that comes real tension points because the generations are significantly different in the shaping of their personality, their identity, their psyche, and their aspirations and dreams. Now, in the 1990s, there was a hurricane that was absolutely devastating. It was called Hurricane Mitch. It hit landmass in Honduras overnight, and overnight it devastated about 80% of the infrastructure of Honduras, both in terms of road, actual physical transportation routes, but also in terms of communication lines, phone lines coming down, etc. And people say that it set Honduras 50 years back in terms of economic development. And the politicians and sort of experts quickly realised that once they had sort of sent in people to save people who were kind of stranded on trees and in communities that had been cut off, they realised that in terms of rebuilding Honduras, they couldn't simply rebuild the roads where they used to be. They had to lay new roads in new places. They had to create new communication and transport systems. There's a very famous picture of a river in Honduras that is running, and the bridge is not over the river because what happened as a result of the hurricane is that the river completely changed course. And so this bridge that used to be over the river is now completely irrelevant. I think that's quite a helpful way to think about the impact of the generational shift, the culture bomb in a way that goes off in each generation, which means that when we look at church and we think about how do we reach under 25s, like our ways of doing it just don't work anymore. The route of confirmation for the Anglican Church, or the route of sending schools workers into schools, or the route of messy church used to work 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But those pipelines don't seem to work anymore. And it's because of this kind of this hurricane, this cultural hurricane that's happened. So a couple of points for you then. Number one, a culture bomb. We're living currently through the fallout of a culture bomb that has gone off. The invention of the printing press, the digital revolution, advancements in internet technologies, some of us, a lot of this has been in our lifetime. My children still cannot get their heads around the fact that the second year into work, I got email. Like the first year, I was still contacting people by phone and by writing letters. And Malcolm Gladwell, he does a brilliant podcast and written some fantastic books like The Tipping Point. He's a bit of a social scientist in a way. He observes how we do things and has brilliant reflections on them. He says the millennial generation, Gen Z, has never known a world without mobile phones, internet, texting and Twitter. And that has profoundly shaped the way they see things. And I guess it's mainly the speed at which they expect their world to work. And if you think about the differences in generations spelled out in terms of social movements. Think about the civil rights movement in America. The baby boomers, that's their kind of generation. That's their civil rights movement. They had one key leader. You can name him Martin Luther King, who spoke with one voice. He is an iconic figure of that very clearly defined movement. But then a few years back, the Occupy movement, this is a millennials-led social movement. There was no one leader. There's lots of different people, lots of different factions and ideals and messages, still massively effective, but very, very different. Because actually millennials organise the world in a very, very different way, decentralised, much more collaboration, much more working together, and therefore much more toxic infighting. And if you want to look at that, you could be thinking about the trans movement. So when you look at the feminist movement and the trans movement, they don't speak with one voice at all. And in fact, some of the hottest debate at the moment on social media about trans rights is between radical feminists and trans activists. And so what we often see played out in the church, that kind of infighting around some fairly hot topics, is not just in the church that we're seeing this. We're seeing it in society as well. So a culture bomb. So let's recognise that. Leading a church with multi-generations is tough. It's beautiful, but it's challenging, it's tough. But the second thing, not just the culture bomb, but the cultural burden. Right now, the world is living through a global cultural movement, and it's a cultural burden. Fear of this virus is going to be in the world and in our communities for years and years to come. The impact of this in terms of unemployment is going to be for years to come. And interestingly, if I look at my generation and below, the way they're talking about it, it's phrases like, the juggle is real. So it's the idea that the struggle, the struggle that our grandparents and great-grandparents' generation went through in terms of the war, we don't call it the struggle, it's more the juggle. It's like juggling the fact that women are full-time working and caring for their children and trying to kind of be socially distancing and trying to stay at home and save lives. And suddenly we're fighting this in a very, very different way. There's phrases that have come out like, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So whereas when I talk to my very elderly relatives here about what it was like in the Second World War, they said everybody did the same thing. Everybody ate the same food. Everybody did exactly the same thing. And yet if you hear people talk today about the pandemic and about lockdown, although we are all, mostly 80% of us, are obeying the social distancing rules, the phrases that are coming out are, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. We're facing this differently. We're also realising, all of us, that we're fragile. We're not invincible. And there's kind of a decentralised leadership structure, SAGE, and lots of talk about trusting the scientific evidence, which works well for some generations and not for others, is cultural burden. But there's something about prophetic observation of the world around us at this time that is so important. John Stott, that brilliant theologian, the evangelical theologian who founded the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, said that we are to do something called double listening, which is listening to God's word, holding that as our highest authority, to be led by God and by His Spirit, but also listening to the world, listening to the voice of the pain, the struggle, the juggle, the fear, the insecurity. And this will take us into a rich space, I believe, for Spirit-inspired innovation. For Spirit-inspired innovation, listening to the unchanging voice of God, but also listening to the rapidly changing voices and expectations and experiences of the generations around us. And when I think about the emerging generations, those aged 25 and younger, and I mainly work with sort of 13s to 25s, I think the emerging generations quite like Jesus, but they don't like the church, because they often perceive us to represent the hierarchies of a past that promoted dangerous and damaging ideologies. Falsely, rightly or wrongly, that's their perception of us. And James Emery White, a church leader in the States who's really experienced in developing church communities that really reach emerging generations, he says this: Generation Z, under 25s, will be the most influential religious force in the West and the heart of the missional challenge facing the church today. And there's a wonderful quote that I'm hoping you've got on your notes by a guy called Jonathan Grant from a brilliant book called Divine Sex. And he says this about the importance of church leaders really understanding the cultural moment they're in. He says, Christian leaders tend to use scripture as their only source for framing Christian speaking and living. Yet only through a kind of thick description of our present circumstances, being attentive both to the world and the church, that's John Stott again, can we deeply understand the hope of the gospel in redefining and reforming the self within our complex times. So he's talking about how understanding not just what's happening for different generations in this moment, but how those things are really shaping a generation's identity, really shaping their expectations, their understanding of who they are, so that we can understand the connecting points with the gospel for them. So here we go. What are some of the key things shaping Generation Z's identity? Well, I've got 5 little ideas for you. Number one, internet. They are the first Wi-Fi enabled generation. So they're the most self-directed. They've got access in their pocket, in their hands, in their devices, with most of the world's living human beings and information. And they don't need hierarchies and institutions like the church to tell them the meaning of life. They want to go and source that themselves. They've got access to that themselves. They are self-directed, and so they don't look to the church thinking, well, if I did have really big questions one day, I know what I'd do. I'd go and seek one of the ancient institutions. I'd go and drink deep from an ancient well. That's not what's happening. What's happening is young people are really wanting to find this stuff in themselves because they've been told that they can be the best filter of all this information. Whether we agree or not is another matter. So the internet. Number 2, the things that are shaping Generation Z's identity, massive cultural misinformation about the self. So the adolescent years hinge precariously on the psychological question, who am I? So in very, very rapidly, if you imagine building somebody's identity like building a chair, you've got 4 legs of the chair, the seat of the chair that rests on the 4 legs, the strength of the legs, and the back of the chair. And the 4 legs of the chair represent 4 key psychological questions that a human being asks during childhood, like, can I trust? Have I got what it takes? Can I get things going? But then adolescence represents the seat of the chair that rests on the security of the other 4 questions being asked. And psychologists say that the question that you are psychologically asking has to be answered. And it'll either be answered positively, yes, you can trust, or negatively, no, all the adults in your life are untrustworthy, they neglect you, they abandon you. And so you go into life with these strengths or weaknesses, really. And for adolescents, they are asking the question, who am I? Which is a massive question. You might feel that you're still asking it now. I think I am sometimes. But in today's climate of unparalleled pressure to conform to consumerism, you've got to be like this, you've got to look like that, you've got to sound like this, you've got to have that kind of identity. This question can lead to an emotionally and mentally painful experience as young people fear that actually they are not enough. And so this overwhelming pushback, you do you work out this kind of complex layer of who you make yourself happy, you're responsible for that, is profoundly unsettling for young people because the happiness they seek is not within their grasp. They are not capable of giving themselves the peace and the hope and the identity that they're looking for. And this idea of individualism is the dangerous modern belief that we can choose our own reality largely free from external influences. And external, for this generation, under 25s, external influences are not perceived as wise voices to be heeded but people trying to stop them from being who they are, the haters. So any voice that contradicts your developing sense of who you think you are is in some way damaging to you. You must have a true and deep and coherent idea of yourself, and then defend that against all the haters. So anything less than wholehearted acceptance of everything about who you perceive yourself to be is seen as a damaging, dangerous thing. And so that's a lot of pressure on young people to have a very clear understanding of who they are, and then feel they've got to kind of defend that in this this kind of marketplace of ideas where everyone's going to shoot them down. So individualism, number 2. Number 3, pornography, something I talk about a huge amount. It's so important that we chat about this in church. It's not just affecting young people, not just affecting men, but it specifically does have a very negative impact on young people. So living online for this generation means also a very close proximity to a universe of pornographies, the consumption of which has the power to rewire the brain and recalibrate their ideas about self-worth, about connection, and about intimacy. And just often what we see in culture is the speed of innovation is often driven by the porn industry. And it's not going to be long before virtual sex is going to be kind of a more widely experienced thing, sex with robots. This is going to need to be on the teaching curriculum of churches in the next 5 years, helping young people understand. And actually, one of the things since lockdown is I've had a number of older teenagers contact me, either from the youth group here at our church or in other places, who said, well, I don't want to have sex until I get married. That's a kind of a belief for me as a Christian. But phone sex, like sex online, like we're not really touching each other. So is this sex? Does God mind? And suddenly our young people are having to navigate what it means to live for Jesus when rapidly shifting technologies enables them to do things that feels like it's actually okay now, because it's not real intimacy, is it? It's not real sex. So we need to be very much leaders that can be thinking theologically well around these issues. So 2 more ideas, and then it's over to you for your discussion. Number 4, the rise of the nuns. Now, not the nuns as in those glorious women that lock themselves away and pray, amazing women, but the NONES, the rise of the nons. They're on that list where people tick, are they Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, or none? They're ticking none. And what we're seeing is that religion is not just seen as irrelevant, but seen as dangerous. And interestingly, in this country, Muslim young people and Christian young people both get tarred with the same brush of being fundamentalists if they are passionate about their faith. And what that means is that increasingly there's going to be no such thing as a nominal Christian among under 30s. If you have an under 30-year-old in your church, they're there because somehow there's something about this that appeals to them. Now, there's obviously a certain age group by which they are dragged to church or they're brought to church, or maybe that kind of the community carries them. But increasingly, we're going to see less young adults coming to church because somehow it makes them look good. If you have a 30-year-old sat in your church pew, you've got somebody who somehow is there because this is significant to them. There's going to be no nominalism in the future. And number 5, new totalitolerance, this idea of safe spaces that you might have heard of. And it's a little bit like my second point, but it's the idea that if somebody's words or ideas disagree with you, it so significantly affects your ability to function that even their presence damages you. This kind of new indoctrination is a cultural phenomenon, but what it means is that young people growing up in church, knowing that their church might have a certain view on, say, remarriage after divorce, or on the role of women in leadership, or on issues around human sexuality, will find those views to be increasingly at odds with the culture. And it's not just that those views are at odds because people don't understand them, but because their friends perceive those positions to be inherently damaging. And so young people who are hearing the goodness of God and who are being taught stories about Jesus reaching out to the lost, the last, the least, and yet being part of a church that also might have as part of their doctrines certain beliefs and understandings of scripture that are not held onto in culture, we'll find that increasingly as, where does this fit the justice issue? If you're telling me that women can't lead, then you're basically telling me that women are second class to God and all this kind of stuff. So we need to really be understanding how young people are hearing us talk about these hot topics, because increasingly they're growing up in a culture that says any questioning over any of these widely held self-evident beliefs is seen as damaging and dangerous. And for many young people, particularly the issue that makes they walk away from faith is around one of these hot issues, not because they don't feel that they can believe in this necessarily, but because they see the impact on their friends' lives of being told you can't be gay and love Jesus. If you're a woman, you can't lead. If you're divorced, you can't get remarried. And the way that's presented. So these are real challenges for us, aren't they, as leaders? So what I'd love you to do is have a little chat about the 3 questions that I have. So number 1, does any of this marry up to your experience? Maybe not, that's fine. And if it doesn't, I wonder why it doesn't, or what else might you add? Number 2, where are we guilty of generational bias in church structures? And number 3, can you identify within your church something that prompts you to say, unless this changes, we're not going to effectively reach the emerging generations? Okay, have a good discussion and I'll see you in a bit.